Hi, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Patty Skinkis. It's March 1st, 2019. We're at Oregon State University. And Patty, we're going to start you off by asking, why viticulture?
Well, originally my attraction was to horticulture. So really the production of interesting plants for me. I didn't originally work with horticultural crops in a younger stage of my life. I've always been in agriculture. So I grew up in agriculture. Knew I liked working with plants, and I liked working with farmers, so production. And horticulture was interesting to me. Didn't grow up working with horticultural crops, decided to focus on that. And as I learned different aspects of horticulture, which there's many, I learned about viticulture, and I thought it was kind of interesting as a crop based on where I grew up. I grew up in Wisconsin, not a grape production area at all. And it was just a new and upcoming crop for the Midwest and the upper Midwest. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, a challenge that I was really interested in considering.
So you said at the time it was just an upcoming crop, so you were kind of at the beginning of viticulture being a thing in the Midwest.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how did you find your way out to Oregon then?
Well, I went to graduate school in the Midwest thinking that I was really learning about the challenges of producing grapes in the Midwest. And when I finished up my graduate degree, there were options to go, you pretty much go where the job is for academia. And I wanted to be in academia to be able to help growers with research and outreach. And job came up at Oregon State, and I interviewed for it and really fell in love with the industry and their engagement with the university, and decided to come out to Oregon when I got the job here right after finishing my PhD.
So did you have any familiarity with Oregon before that?
Not at all. No. I just knew it was on the West Coast. I knew about Oregon from a horticultural standpoint. Certainly I knew it was a wine production region, but in learning about horticulture, you learn about Oregon because it is such a horticultural mecca with respect to the nursery crops and the different small fruits crops that are grown here. Yeah.
What were your impressions when you came out for the interview and when you kind of started to familiarize yourself with the area?
I was really impressed with the first and foremost thing was that how many industry were involved in the interview. And I had interviewed at a number of different universities for similar viticulture positions, and they did not have nearly the amount of buy-in and interest among the industry. So I remember sitting in a room up in the Dundee Hills at the Dundee Bistro with about 30 growers or winemakers jammed into this room, all there to ask me questions and learn about who I was, and they were really interested in who they were going to hire for this position. So
what did that tell you? Was that good? It was good. Obviously, they're interested. Was it also a lot of pressure?
I certainly a lot of pressure as a new PhD student finishing up. But I think for me, it was just it was good pressure. It was that they had interest. They were involved. It wasn't just they weren't just interested. There wasn't just a handful of people there that were asked to be there. They wanted to be there, and that was very clear in how the questions came out, and that they saw the future for what they wanted to learn and where they wanted to advance to in the future, and from an education and research standpoint. So yeah, it was really impressive. There was no other industry group that I met with in other areas of the U.S. for other jobs that were that engaged. So it was that engagement that was really impressive.
Do you remember what the concerns they had were at the time, what they were looking at, what they were asking you about specifically?
Oh, they asked me about a lot of different things, but I do remember the question about different sustainability practices, organic, biodynamic, even at that time, and that was 12 years ago. A lot of interest in just ways to make better quality wines, and it was really in similar standpoints that they're dealing with today. Certainly now we have different questions that they didn't have back then, but
sure.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the Oregon Wine Research Institute and what sort of its goals are, and then what your role is in the bigger picture.
Sure. So the Oregon Wine Research Institute is really, I like to call it a working group of researchers and outreach specialists here at Oregon State University and our partners at the USDA Agriculture Research Service. That really is a way to, we all are already here, but it was a way to package us together, get us to work together, in a more common way. So, we all would generally have some organic relationships between collaborative projects or doing outreach, but this was a way to make it a much more concerted effort. So there's an administrative staff, 2 members, that will basically keep us all organized and allow the many different researchers who are involved to get together and have a continuing conversation about how to meet the needs of the industry and how to advance the science. So it's monthly meetings that we have and some core events that we do for outreach to the industry. So I think the biggest thing is coordination of those of us who are already working in grapes and wine, and then providing a more deliberate outreach. So we do a lot of outreach to the industry, letting them know our best suggestions for management in the vineyard or winery or business, and then providing those research data to support that from our varied research projects.
And so what is your role specifically within that?
So I'm one of the core members. So there's I think about more than 10 scientists that are part of the team, probably closer to 15. And I'm one of the core faculty. So I'm one of the main viticulturists. So there's only, a lot of the other faculty work with other disciplines that are related to, grapes or wine, whereas my focus 100% is viticulture. So I work with grape growers and on the vine physiology and production end. And my role is also, because I also have an extension appointment, a lot of my efforts are to help in that coordinating the outreach amongst the scientists. So for me, even if we didn't have the Oregon Wine Research Institute, I would do outreach. But it adds a level of support to my program to be able to do my extension outreach more effectively as a team.
So let's talk about the extension outreach a little bit on that. So describe what we mean by an extension program, and then how it's become part of the OWRI and what the purpose is.
Sure. So an extension program is really a long-lived program of the land-grant university system, and it is actually one of the main reasons I got into academia, because extension is the kind of outreach arm of agricultural universities to ensure that the information that we generate from research is distributed to the end user. In our case, it would be the Oregon wine industry. So I was hired mainly to do that work. I also do research and teaching, but the bulk of what I do was with the extension. So as a state specialist, there's different tiers of people, but as a state specialist, I oversee the program for the state of Oregon, and I have collaborators, other faculty who are in the counties that help support the local groups. So I develop programs that could be face-to-face or online or print materials that basically are just different formats for us to get the information from our research to the industry on key topics that are a concern for them. So I always feel like it's Extension's job to be the troubleshooters for whatever discipline it may be. So for me, it's been, what are the challenges in the vineyard that can be addressed by doing research and providing outreach to the industry. So that's kind of in a nutshell what the extension program is developed. And I would say where there becomes confusion is a lot of, even amongst academics, is they'll say, well, there's people who will give talks or give presentations, and so we consider that outreach. But extension is where you really have an ownership to the whole process of delivering information. So that's where I, as an extension specialist, and that's part of my job, to think about delivering information in a package or in a way that's more creative than just saying, I'm going to give a presentation at the symposium, or I'm going to do a lecture here or there. So it's really developing that platform for information delivery relative to the content area.
So how are your priorities set? Is it mostly things that you're interested in, that you think the industry will be interested in, or are you mostly reacting to things that are of sudden importance in the industry?
So definitely I work on, certainly I'm a viticulturist, so I always keep at the constraints of that. I'm not going to work in wine production. I have collaborators for that. So I stay focused on viticulture, but within that I usually look to what are the questions that need to be addressed. And there's always some that are kind of underlying themes of question that can be built upon later. So certainly there are things that maybe the industry doesn't recognize, but I identify as, well, if they knew this, then they could do this.
Sure.
So there's some of those things, I consider those the longer term projects, or whether it's outreach or research that I do. But then there's the immediate. And so there's always, let's say 30% of my time is on the immediate. And then maybe the rest of the time is on the more kind of underlying basic principles of vineyard production or viticulture that I address. But definitely there's that need for somebody to address what's going on right now. So, last fall there's evidence of vole damage. And so, I try to figure out what's going on with voles. I'm not a mammalian scientist, but they're affecting the vines. So pull in information from my fellow extension wildlife specialists to say, what information do we need to know? Document it, in part just so that the rest of the industry can know that it is a problem more than just what they see in their vineyard. So, that's an example of something that just pops up. Or, several years ago we had a mite issue. So these little tiny insects or mite would affect the grapevines, and it was a question of what are they doing, how can we manage them. So I really try to bring in the information from a viticulturist standpoint, not just an entomologist or somebody else, to bring that in and integrate knowledge as the need arises. So those sorts of things will come. I'll work on them for a year, 2, 3, and then move on to other things as other issues come up.
What have been maybe the biggest issues you felt like you've had to deal with since you've been here? Whether it's something that you are working on because you think it would help the industry, or it's something you've had to react to in the industry?
I would say definitely the work I've been doing in yield management. And so that one was the one that I saw when I first came in. I was very cautious in managing because there's always this paradigm of low yield equals higher quality. And as I came into Oregon, I wasn't used to, I had to learn a lot. I had to learn a lot about just how grapevines grow here versus where I had been trained, and just learn the system. And I thought, we've got beautiful vineyards. They can handle, productivity is pretty high from a plant perspective. Photosynthesis ability is high. They're green and healthy, but we are limiting our crop level. And in the beginning, I was very concerned about testing that because of the potential, it's going against the norms of that low yield equals high quality paradigm. So I started quietly doing some of that work with small trials in, about 2010. And by 2012, we had advanced quite quickly to a large-scale multi-collaborator project, and because of the economy. So the economy had tanked, and now they had to focus on making more profit out of their vineyards and looking at, can we do more with what we've got? And the trial really addressed that key number for any business in agriculture is yield. You increase yield, you increase potential profitability. And so that was something that we embarked on back in 2012, and it's been really helpful from the standpoint of it was a time when they were ready to receive that information, but I also didn't know what the results would be. I didn't come in and say, I thought my hypothesis was that we can yield more and come up with smarter yield management guidelines that are nimble to the individual merits of the vineyard and its productive capacity, rather than saying it's got to all be X tons per acre.
Sure.
And since we've done that work, it's been really impressive to see that there has been the change in the adoption in industry from the results of the study. And so we look to the state data and we see that they've had a 25% increase in their yields reported to the state at the end of the year. So these are numbers that are coming in. They're still doing yield management, meaning they're cutting some crop off those vines, but they're not restricting it as low as they used to.
Sure.
So some of the producers who were part of the project are to thank for this, because certainly I recognize that there was no way I was going to convince anybody that they could change their yield without engaging them in that process. But also I thought the benefit is that now I'm getting information from a number of different sites. So we did this work across vineyards and wineries on a commercial scale, and then quantified and analyzed the data to show that they could increase yields. And that was, a two-part approach to, not just the research, but the research was amongst the industry. They could see firsthand the results, even if they never saw the data.
Sure.
So that was really I think one of the most important aspects of that work, is that getting it into their hands allowed for them to adopt and learn and change over time. So I think it's had economic impact, as well as, just for me, learning a lot about how the process beyond just the viticulture realm influences the whole production chain, because there are ramifications from the vineyard to the winery to the sales. So it's been, for me, the most fruitful project. So,
literally too.
Yeah, literally.
So it's a fairly young industry still. Do you find that when you're trying to do things like this, do you find a lot of people fairly set in their ways, or do you find the industry is pretty willing to work with you?
I think that, that's the kind of the two sides of this, is that I think the industry is young enough that they are willing to learn, and so I think that's one of the reasons they came to the table as collaborators of the project. We've had 28 companies take part in the project since 2012. Not all of them for that every year of that project, but 28 companies over that time. And when we asked them why they wanted to be involved, it was because they had that same curiosity. So, but we also recognized in that project that even within some of these companies, they had a tough road to go, because they had still that adherence to that standard of okay, low yields equals high quality, and this was going against that. So there were some internal struggles just even within their own companies of the collaborators. They recognized that it was hard. And then outside of the project, people looking in and watching the project over the years, some of them have been able to change because they have the freedom to do so, meaning that they are estate vineyards and wineries, so they don't have to sell their fruit. And the ones that have the struggle are still those who are selling their fruit. So there is still a portion of the industry that hasn't come along with the newest information yet, and I expect that'll take some time. So there is that energy out there for new information, but there still is that adherence to what is the long-held norms of the industry, and some of that just comes with the territory of this industry. There's some key things that over time have become the standard perhaps for somewhere else, and what I'm trying to do is test those standards here. And is it appropriate to be used here? There's always a reason for something. It may not always be what we think, and that's always the background that we're trying to understand. So kind of the myth busting, I'd like to say in some cases, but it's not just busting the myth. Because I don't want to say that these norms are a myth, because they're not. There's always a reason for something. It's just understanding what our parameters are and adjusting them for our own climate and our own situation, our economic climate as well as physical climate.
Sure. I'm curious, you have 28 different sites scattered throughout is it in the valley, outside the valley as well?
It's in the Willamette Valley,
okay.
Mainly Willamette Valley, yeah.
How different did you find your results from vineyard to vineyard? Was it wildly different in terms of how much crop they could handle, or did you find a fairly similar line?
Well, it's interesting, because certainly different vineyards, even though they're all in the Willamette Valley, or majority are in the Willamette Valley, they have different productive capacity, meaning they can yield more at some than at other sites. And we look at everything on a per linear foot basis, so we don't look on a tons per acre basis. So that's really coming down to the same common denominator for all vineyards. So some are more productive, and it could be because of how vigorous those sites are, or the soil type. But what was less different, so the diversity of the sites was greater than perhaps the results. So the results were really that removing crop or lowering your yields really didn't have all that big of a difference at the majority of sites, regardless of the fact that they had different productive capacity. So some might have started up here and some started here, and they lowered the crop to different degrees, but the change didn't always create the same response. And what was uniform is that a lot of them have very small differences, and it wasn't consistent year by year. So it wasn't what I had expected, and I think what a lot of the collaborators had expected, was for a standard that was so strongly held that if you were to do this test, that you would be able to see big differences, because that's the reason for them even doing the practice. But we didn't see that to be the case. And so even our basic ripeness, so our sugars, our acids, so Brix, PHTA, weren't affected in most vineyards in each year, which is the primary kind of, do we get to ripeness? And so it was really interesting to see that we weren't having that impact. And although we think we should, because we put all this effort in.
So what's the takeaway then for the growers from that? What is it that they have learned that they can take forward from that?
So what we did interviews and surveys of all the collaborators, and their response was that they definitely knew they could increase their yields without compromising quality to an extent. And a lot of them agreed that it was between 0.5 to 1 ton per acre that they could increase their yield.
Wow.
And so for other industries, maybe in California where yield is much higher, it doesn't seem like a big difference, but it's a big difference for growers here and winemakers and wineries here. And I think the most important thing that they said in their interviews was that they decreased the cost of goods sold, so they could increase their profitability. So it was, that by having more yield and more production volume in a certain tier would allow them a better profitability. And I think that's why we're seeing that general trend towards a slightly increased yield in the last 5 years, was because of that. Others are recognizing that too.
Sure. So you work with the industry on a large scale. How do you make connections to the industry? Are you approaching people? Are they coming to you? Is there a certain kind of person you're looking for to work with, or is it kind of a happy accident?
Because my extension appointment, I'm interacting with industry a lot, and a lot of times the specific arrangements of research projects, I might be seeking out certain vineyards. At this stage, I know a lot of vineyards, certainly not all of them, but I know about certain vineyards from having conversations with them and doing research on their sites, that I can usually kind of select certain producers that I know will be really good collaborators, that understand what it means to do research on site, and I can work with them. But it's kind of a naturally occurring process. But many of them I'm not cold calling, because they've interacted with me, in whether it's through outreach or through research in the past. Some of the ways that I've interacted with the industry to address not only priorities of what they're concerned about, and to find collaborators, is we have these technical groups that we developed. So in the Willamette Valley, we have the Willamette Valley Viticulture Technical Group, and that was actually developed by industry. So Alan Holstein developed that group, and when I came into Oregon, he invited me to take part. And it was a very small group, and within a year or so, the industry and Alan had said, can we want to help, have you help us coordinate this group? And at the time they said, well, we want you to lead it. And I said, no, I will not lead this. This is an industry group. I will co-lead, because I felt it was very important that it still stay with industry, and that Extension had its role, and I myself had my role, but I felt that I didn't want to co-opt it. I didn't want Extension to take it, because it could lead a different way, and I wanted it still to have that spirit of being originating in and being amongst the industry. So since 2008, I co-chaired it with Alan Holstein. And then last year, in 2018, we had he passed the torch on to Ken Kupperman of Jackson Family Wines. So I co-chair that with him, and it's a really good group. I've shared this model with other extension faculty at Oregon State and other universities across the nation, because to me it's like a very obvious thing to do, but it's not always so easy in practice. But what we do is we get together and we're organized, but we're not formal in the sense that we don't, where there's no president and there's no administrative level. And we really address, at the time, we come up with an agenda for every meeting, and we talk about something that's of importance for the industry, with an eye towards finding answers from research perspective. So the research might be done by academics, but it also might be done in industry. So if a grower is doing a trial or a winemaker is doing a trial, they might showcase it in our meetings. But a lot of times it's the researchers. And what we do there too as researchers, if we want to pitch an idea, we go there and we talk to them and say, what do you think about this? And they give feedback, or, you know, it helps us get that feedback on, you know, getting a pulse on what the industry needs. And it's especially helpful for those faculty who don't work as directly with the industry, but at least we have that platform there that I can work with them, incorporate them in. Industry can feel like they have more than just me. They can work with other people too to address their concerns. So through the technical groups, I think it's been a really fun way to have a continuing conversation about research. And we have a mailing list of, I think, about 60 people. And at any meeting, we might have between 35 and 40 people. So it's become very popular. People want to be there. I think that's the biggest thing. When we call a meeting, people want to be there. They don't have to be there. They want to be there.
Sure.
So.
How have you felt that the vineyard owners, vineyard workers, people you've worked with have responded to your work since you've been here? Has it been a mostly positive interaction? Have you had people who were skeptical of what you're trying to do?
It certainly has been positive. I'm sure there's been people who are skeptical. But whenever you do research that might change or do something different, certainly there's skeptics into, you know, treatments that I would do in certain trials. And I remember explaining why you do certain things and to bookend, you know, you want to do extreme treatments. But most of my work is very applied viticulture, and it's in commercial vineyards. So I keep an eye towards practicality. It's not doing some absurd physiological trial. If I'm going to do those, I'll do it at a research vineyard or something. But I think most of it's been positive, certainly. And honestly, sometimes when people are thanking me, I just think, well, this is my job, you know. And I feel very grateful that people have been very supportive and have always provided very positive feedback about the projects I've had in the program overall. But I think that also makes me feel good in the work that I do, because I'm doing it for industry, and I certainly wouldn't want them to feel like they haven't benefited in some way. So.
You mentioned having to kind of explain why you do what you do. I'm curious if you have people who expect you to have a quick fix to some of these issues, or do they understand the process?
Definitely, I think the majority don't understand the process of research and how long it takes for information to be generated. But what I found the way to handle that, there's a small percentage that, you know, understand and will wait. But a lot of times they want quick answers, and you just can't come up with quick answers, and it takes time to put it all together. But one of the things I do is I try to educate people in that process and why it does take so long, whereas, you know, some in academia may not be as, you know, patient and they don't want to deal with those kind of inquiries. But in extension, you know, we're used to those kinds of questions coming in, and we can always provide them with something. But I think the biggest thing I found successful in outreach and in research is that explaining the process is part of the battle. And if they understand the process, then it doesn't feel like we're ignoring their questions, that it just takes time. So a recent example would be this onset of or finding of red blotch virus. A lot of people were made aware of it. It's been a virus. We've had it probably in vineyards for decades, if not longer. And now they're aware of it. So then they see it, they're testing for it, and they want to know what to do. And we can't recommend certain things legally. So we can't recommend pesticides if we don't know what the pest is that's vectoring it. So then, you know, I have to follow legal guidelines on certain things, but then I'll explain why we don't know what the vector is and why you can't spray an insecticide for a vector to manage a virus or things like that. But we do approach it when I hear enough inquiries coming in, then it's like, okay, well, we need to come up with our own data for Oregon, and then we start research projects to address those, to give them some answer in the interim. You know, we recognize we may not understand completely about the whole disease complex, but let's try what we can, because we know if we don't, the growers are going to try stuff. So we'll try to get them some answer and help them along the way. So
I'm curious at this point, you don't have to name any names obviously, but what's the most interesting or bizarre question you've gotten from a grower, or something a research topic they wanted you to attack that you thought was kind of out of left field?
Oh boy, that's a good question. None comes to mind.
None comes to
right
mind?
now.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you think of one.
Yeah, none comes to mind. I mean, there's always, people always are excited and have ideas, and they want me to work in their vineyards. And, I wish I could, but there's only so many vineyards you can work in, or so many ideas that you can handle at one time. And so, yeah, I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now that.
So where do you position yourself in the industry? Where do you feel you fall in the Oregon wine industry?
Oh, I don't know how to answer that question. In terms of.
Just curious how you feel you fit into the greater industry at all. Is there what role do you feel you play, I guess,
Okay.
in the larger industry?
So I guess I would say, I think many academics feel like they're outsiders and they're not really part of industry. Mm-hmm. But I would say I definitely feel like I am part of industry. I'm not a vineyard manager, I'm not a winery owner, but I do feel like I'm part of industry because I'm a part of their everyday operations. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're not contacting me every day, some might, but mostly they're not, but I'm trying to provide them with tools that they're using every day. So I definitely feel like I'm a part of the industry and not a separate entity. I'm not outside looking in. And I feel like, where most of my influence is definitely in that where the work is getting done, mm-hmm. Where they're making decisions in the vineyard and making decisions about how they're going to make the best fruit by the end of the year. So I definitely feel like it's in the get things done sort of group within the industry. Yeah.
What kind of changes have you seen in how people approach grape growing since you've come into the state of the industry? You said about mm-hmm. 12 or so years ago.
Sure.
What kind of changes have you seen in the way people approach grape growing?
So I think it's actually a really exciting time, and I thought so even 12 years ago when I came in, because we're transitioning from the older generation that established the industry, mm-hmm. and then now we see it expanding, and now we're getting in a lot of new talent, a lot of new energy from companies where they're hiring people who have degrees in viticulture and enology, or at least degrees trained to be, this is their job. Mm-hmm. Their job is a viticulturist. And as we have those viticulturists and enologists who are trained in these areas coming in, it elevates the level of questions. And it's really been enjoyable to watch that transition and move towards a more specific approach to how they address troubleshooting and how they want to think about vineyard design, or how they want to change what they do instead of always doing what they did 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So I see this mm-hmm. constant improvement and building upon the prior generation's knowledge.
Interesting. Tell us a little bit about what it's like on the teaching part of your job, teaching students in viticulture and possibly teaching like the next generation mm-hmm. of Oregon grape growers. What is that like for you, and what are your goals with that, I guess?
So when I was originally hired, wasn't supposed to have a teaching appointment, but very quickly it became obvious there were viticulture courses and nobody to teach them, and I was the only viticulturist. So put two and two together, I was going to teach. I enjoy teaching, and I think that my position really covers the three missions of the land-grant university: teaching, research, and extension. Mm-hmm. So I feel like it all dovetails together, and although they are discrete packages of material or content or work that I'm doing, I try to integrate the three. And I think that's why it becomes very seamless. So when I teach my classes, I actually think it's a great opportunity to see the future mm-hmm. and to train the future. So some of them kind of get scared when I'm teaching classes because I'll explain who I am, and as the extension specialist, I'm working with industry, and I'm not just up in the White Tower. And so I always say this, and more to be genuine, not to scare them, is that you're not done with me yet. Because if they stay in Oregon, they're going to be interacting with me, they're going to be connecting to OSU Extension, they're going to see me again. Mm-hmm. So some of them, they get a little scared about that, but then others, they welcome that. They mm-hmm. enjoy that interaction and the insight that I bring to the classroom because I'm out there working with industry. Mm-hmm. I'm not just saying how it should be in theory. So So I enjoy working with the students, and most of them are juniors, seniors, or graduate students that are ready to, graduate and move right into industry right when they finish my courses. So
interesting. Do you find that they are often they want to be in Oregon long term and they're here to be here?
Yeah, so that's been the interesting thing because we have a relatively small industry relative to the others on the West Coast, and the majority of the students come here and want to stay here. Whether it's on the enology side or the viticulture side. So yeah, sometimes we're getting students from California, and even though they're coming from California, they don't necessarily intend to go back to California. But yeah, we have mostly Oregon students, but they mostly want to stay in Oregon.
How do you you talked about the teaching, research, extension as kind of the three prongs. How do you balance your time and energies between those given all of the demands on your time?
Oh, it's challenging. I'm always trying to figure out a better way to do those things, but the best way to balance is kind of like the crop year of grapes. I kind of look at right now I'm in my extension season. I do a lot of outreach to industry from face-to-face standpoint. My teaching is in spring, and even though most people would say that's crazy, that's when the crop year is starting with bud break, but it's not as hard as other times of year to do the teaching. So I'm teaching in spring, and then in summer that's in the full thrust of the field research season. And then I do all the research, and there's some extension intermingled through that phase, but it's kind of I've got my heavier seasons for certain foci, but then there's always an interconnection between those. So I'll do extension year round, but the focus will just change percentages as the year goes by. Yeah.
Sounds exhausting, but also very cool.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's important for people in and out of the industry, or especially in the industry, to have a formal wine and grape education?
Well, certainly I think it doesn't necessarily have to be formal viticulture and enology training. I think agriculture, horticulture training, we actually did a study to question producers as well as students what students thought they needed and what employers wanted. And the study showed that the employers said they don't necessarily expect that you have a viticulture and enology degree, but they wanted for at least vineyard and winery type positions that they were agricultural based and science based. And so I think that's important because when they have these full-time career jobs, having that foundational knowledge is helpful to understanding the future production questions that they'll be dealing with in a vineyard or a winery. And certainly when you've got that background, it allows you to ask different questions. If you understand pests and the crop cycle, you now can more intelligently ask questions about designing a spray program to deal with those pests. Whereas I think 30 years ago, somebody in my position would have been teaching them about the very basics of what it means to grow a plant. And it's not to put those people down. It's just like some of those people came up through a different route in their life. And now that we've got people who are being hired with the background in understanding agriculture, understanding plant sciences or fermentation sciences, they can ask different questions because you already understand the basics of that system.
Sure.
Yeah.
What do you think of the growth in the wine and grape educational resources in the state? Since you've been here, obviously Chemeketa has boosted its program, Oregon State's program has grown. We at Linfield now have our program. So what do you think of the growing opportunities, and do you think that's something that's going to continue in the future?
I certainly think it is going to continue in the future, and I think it's been great to see the expansion of the educational opportunities because now there are some local institutions that can provide that for Oregon rather than sending people off to different states and having perhaps information that's not as relevant. And so I think that's been the benefit, is that it's local, it's relevant to what is produced here, and then you're producing a crop of students that then can work in these different areas. And I think it's been excellent to see the specification of the different educational programs. So, for example, we will train students in a certain way for certain types of positions. And I remember having some students coming in, they'll go through our program and they're like, oh boy, they're more of a business student. They should have really been in a different program. So now that Linfield has the program that's there, we can now encourage people to go that route, because it's a very different route than if they go to viticulture or enology. And the same is true for the community colleges. I've also thought the community college, they fit a niche for people who don't want a 4-year degree. They want to come in, learn, and go out and do. And vice versa. I really think that there's going to be a huge strength in this. Students who go to the community college get trained on the hands-on first and then come here. We haven't had a lot of that yet, but I think that some of our shining future is that if students do that, then they know this is what I want to do. Whereas in a 4-year, you don't know if it's what you want to do necessarily, and you go all 4 years and then you're like, oh, this is the one I signed up for. But if you do the community college program, you kind of get a glimpse of that ahead of time, and then you can go delve deeper into the education. So I think that we've got a really strong educational program kind of group here, even though they're kind of doing their own thing. There's intermingling. So when I talk to students before they come here, I say, here are your options. Let's find what's best for you. It may not be viticulture. It might be enology. It might be Chemeketa. It might be Umpqua Community College. It might be Linfield, depending on that. So it's really finding the best fit for the student. And now we have an avenue to send students instead of saying, well, we don't know what to do with you if you want to do wine business, So,
Sure.
Yeah.
What's it like being a woman in the wine industry, particularly in research and viticulture areas?
So that's a great question. So my background is that I grew up in the dairy industry. So the dairy industry seemingly has plenty of women in so when I came in, and I grew up on my family's dairy farm. So my dad and my mom, they owned it, they ran it, and they were equals. And I mean, there was a lot of women, like our crop consultant was a woman, our vet, one of many vets were women. So to me, it wasn't that odd for a woman in agriculture. But as I started going through graduate school and training graduate students myself, it became very much a concern of women who I was training. How do I go in this male-dominated field, which it is. When I first started, I was probably the only woman in the room, whether it was academics or whether it was industry. It didn't bother me, it didn't scare me, but it was something that, I recognized other people who were coming into the program, getting trained. It was something scary for them, how do you deal with that? And but for me, I think, I've always held my ground. I've always been, I don't let things, I never perceived any issue either, though. So it's not, I think maybe people were testing me in the beginning because I was this young woman who had just come into the industry. But certainly I felt more engaged with them, and it wasn't like they were testing me or creating an environment that wasn't easy to deal with. But yeah, I've been, and maybe it's the time in the industry that I entered into, but it's been a great experience, and we now see more women than ever before. I don't know if that's partly because of me working with some of those people, or there's just more women in agriculture in these positions over time. But yeah, now we have certainly it's not 50-50 in meetings, but we have more women in our technical groups, in our different various industry groups that we're meeting with. And there's more women in academia that we have. Not many more, but our OWRI core faculty is really, I think, only 2 women, and the rest are men. So, yeah.
Do you find yourself mentoring women who want to do what you're doing? If they're just a few years behind you now, do you find yourself answering these kinds of questions and helping them find a place?
Yeah, definitely. I think, that was the one thing that surprised me, because I didn't really think about it. It was always when these questions came up from others, in that gender divide. And so, yeah, I do definitely get past students or other people who have come in who weren't our students that would just, talk to me about how do you deal with some of these things, or how do you navigate? And I think certainly some have just watched how I do my extension program, or how I do my research, and kind of take that and as a information from a role model. Sure. So yeah, definitely have been asked questions, and navigating like raising the ranks in the job market as well in the wine industry. Had fielded a lot of questions about that. It's probably one of the biggest, other than getting into the industry. It's the advancing in the industry.
How do you answer when people ask you how to get into the industry?
How to get into the
Yeah.
industry? For students, it's my answer usually is let's find you the right academic program or training program, whether it is even a training program or maybe just getting them into internships. So it's really asking their background and seeing what deficiencies they have that would need to be filled to make them most successful.
Where do you think the Oregon wine industry is heading? What do you see down the road for viticulture specific, but also just for the industry at large?
So for viticulture, we are still a pretty small industry, and I think the future in our research for viticulture is there's always this question of there's the fundamental research that is really long term and not really applied, and then there's the applied. And although there's always the respect for fundamental, I think we're still really an industry that needs to focus its research efforts on the applied. Just because we're small, we need to address the concerns that we have here. I am an applied researcher, but that's why I stayed as that. I mean, that's what I'm trained as. That's what I'm going to do. But really, to me, I think there's so many basic from the standpoint of production basic. Really questions that we sometimes surpass because we're looking at a more flashy item from the research perspective that we still haven't addressed. And there's so many things that I've done in my program, like what do we know about how timing of berry development? And so I did a 6-year project to say, okay, now maybe this will help us estimate our crop better. But it's just a really simple question that nobody looked at. So I think we've got a lot of those in the Oregon industry that is going to be the future is, can we stay focused enough to address those before we jump on to these other bigger questions? And that doesn't mean that we won't have more fundamental work in our future, but because of the nature of our industry and the needs, I think, we really need to have an eye towards that applied viticulture research. And then where the industry is advancing in the future, I think this is a very interesting time because of how the industry from a business standpoint is changing, how the market is changing, and how much the market will drive that change. That's what, it's a little unknown, but I think also a very interesting time for innovation. And I think people who have really had their heart set on the really high-end wine, I think we can still do high-end wine, but it might change form. It may not be the traditional form that we've always thought about it. We've got to think more uniquely, and I think that's where our successes will be in the future, is just how do we define that road and how do we get on it?
Do you see a shift in what Oregon will be known for down the road? Do you see a varietal shift? Do you see climate change causing any kind of issue like that? As you look down the road, what kind of things are you thinking about, like big picture?
Oh, good. That's a good question. I have a hard time thinking that we'll have a major shift in our variety focus, just because it takes so long to get that effort, to have this brand Oregon being related to Pinot Noir. And quality. I think that's, to me, there's 3 things we're known for. We're known for quality, we're known for Pinot Noir, and we're known for sustainability. And I think that's going to stay the same, and I think it would behoove us to stay the same just because of the realities of the market. But I think that's also a room for advancement. It doesn't mean that Pinot Noir is going to be the only thing we focus on. I think there's things we can start to look into that will be on the end of quality and end of sustainability that surpass just Pinot Noir, especially as we get the warmer climate. We see that already happening. But the warmer climate has also meant maybe we're making more consistent Pinot Noir. It doesn't mean we have to toss the Pinot and grow something else just yet. So I think there's a lot of expansion in those 3 areas: quality, variety, and sustainability.
Are there any major concerns you have as you look at things you're interested in your research now that you think the industry is going to be dealing with in a decade or in 20 years, things that are cropping up? Or basic questions that haven't been answered yet?
Well, there's a lot of those little basic questions that haven't been answered yet. I think, some of the questions, we're trying to do some preliminary work on this right now, is, we are mainly an industry that's grown on rootstock, which is typical for wine production across the world. But our early years of the industry were on own rooted vines. Now we're on rootstock. We've been on rootstock for 20 years or more. But what does that mean? You know, we haven't really looked at that. And so right now we have a postdoc in 3 of our labs. It's one postdoc across labs that's looking at a fundamental question of, with these rootstock, how is it moderating our vigor? So it's a really basic question. From that, maybe we can determine new studies to do in the future with different rootstocks or different nutrient management regimes to alter our plant growth a bit more in the vineyard. So I think that's where our hands are tied by what we have available to us with rootstocks and scions or cultivars, and then, you know, is there a way to enhance that, or can we get new rootstocks? New rootstocks can take a long time to develop, and nobody's really developing new rootstocks other than for nematode resistance. So, yeah.
I hadn't heard about that yet, so that's new. What's in the future for you personally? What kind of projects are you working on that you're excited about?
Well, I'm continuing the rest of my my long-term yield management trial for the next 3 years to fill out a full 10-year project. I'm also wanting to branch into some work with Chardonnay, just trying to have better idea of how to manage for high-quality Chardonnay, because we spent so much time, we meaning the industry, but also researchers, looking at Pinot Noir. But now they really want to craft a very high-quality Chardonnay, and the question is, well, we're applying Pinot Noir standards for management to Chardonnay, should we be? So there's some studies there, but also it's not really fundamental research, but it's more physiological research that I've been doing with fruitfulness to really understand what drives our yield. So back to the origin of the bud, you know, how much fruitfulness capacity do we have and what drives that? So I've done a number of studies over the last 4 or 5 years with different aspects of what's driving fruitfulness. So we are just wrapping up a nitrogen trial and a pruning trial. So now we want to take it to another step and try to alter it a little bit more. So doing some studies like that in the future.
So never bored.
I'm never bored. I always have plenty of work, and I'm sure the industry would, if I was ever bored, they would sure make sure that I had something to work on.
Do you have is there a favorite part of what you do? Do you enjoy a certain part of your job more than the rest, or a certain part of the year more than the rest?
I know what parts of the year I do not like. I definitely, the summer is, every season of my work is definitely got its positives. The summer is nice in the fact that, you know, we're in the field. We can see what's going on. The projects are going. The lab is fully running. I mean, the lab is the lab. My students in the lab, my staff, are always working. But it's when they're in the field we're seeing, and we're making decisions right then and there. It's also the time when the industry has their decisions on a production end. And then, you know, I do less outreach at that time, but there's still the outreach from the standpoint of phone calls and emails that I'm addressing. So I think the summer is kind of that neat time period that's busy, but you're evolving with the season, you're, you know, listening to the questions, and you don't know what the season's going to bring. You can guess based on the weather, climate, etc., but you just don't know until you're in it. So, yeah, so I think that's the exciting part, is to see what we see, do what we need to do, and then hear the impact and kind of be that full circle in the summer.
Sure. What about the OWRI? What do you see it heading in the future? Or what do you see the Oregon State Viticulture Enology kind of overall? What do you see it heading in the future? What are your hopes for it?
Well, my hopes is that we'll continue to grow as a team of researchers that really have a common goal of doing good work for the industry and making sure they know about it in terms of the results. You know, not that we're great, but that, you know, the results are there and we're doing that for them. I think, and that's what we've really tried over the years, to establish our outreach and establish this group. And we really do have a good group of people that come together and work together, and we know what each other are doing for projects, and that we can kind of work together on different things. So I'm hoping that will continue to thrive in the future, that we can have the industry understand that a little bit more. You know, in the reality, a lot of times they get caught up in the title. Well, the title is just a title. I mean, we're all still the group of people, but the difference is now we come together as a unified group to address that. So I think that, I hope that'll thrive in the future, and as we have people move on, whether it's retirements, we're not there yet, that we'll continue to have good people in the program for that. And then for our undergraduate program, I think that is going to continue to grow, and I think where it'll be interesting in the future is to have more of that interconnection between the degree programs. I mean, it exists already, but I think so many students don't understand that, you know, if I could tell anything to somebody who wanted to get trained, is that just call the people who teach, because we have the ability to make things happen that you don't find on a website, or you don't find, you know, just talk to us, you know. And I've been amazed when I'm going from a student to a faculty member, how flexible we can be, and accepting courses from different programs and making it work for somebody who has a plan. So, you know, while we don't have a formal, you know, juncture between the different institutions, there is an informal one that can be made very easily. Yeah.
So I'm curious, backing up a little bit here, I'm curious, when you started here, when you were coming, you just gotten your PhD, or coming out to Oregon, how prepared did you feel, and how prepared were you actually? How big was the learning curve when you started?
Well, so graduate school definitely trains you to be a researcher. So, of course, you know, you go through that design of your research, you develop, you know, you analyze the data and you publish. And so I had been through all those steps, and I had done, you know, I at least had a background of having been in agriculture. So for me, it was just applying that knowledge of agriculture, how to work with agriculturists and farmers. I had already grown up with that. So in the dairy industry, it's a different crop and different product, but you know, you can understand. And so I feel like, you know, I knew I had a lot to learn still, and they hired me as an assistant prof. So I came in knowing that, you know, I'm going to learn from industry, and they're going to learn something from me. So it's going to be a give and take. So that was the way I approached it. And so, you know, I worked really, really hard in my first 3 years. I'd say I was almost never in my office. I mean, I was in it, but I wasn't, a lot of times I was in every meeting I could be in with industry. I was making meetings with people, whether they're other academics, to learn what their area is, so I'm not stepping on academic toes. You know, just feeling out the academic landscape, feeling out the industry landscape, and then coming up with where it was that I needed to be and to do my job. So I think that's normal for everybody coming out of their PhD but it's a huge challenge. And it's not for the faint-hearted. You know, you need to roll up your sleeves and hit the ground running as soon as you get in the door. So, yeah, and now having trained graduate students that I want so badly to train to do what I do, and they want to. Some of the deficiencies I see that come to me, and I didn't even recognize it at the time, was they don't have the background in agriculture. Their first exposure to agriculture might have been their bachelor's.
Together.
Yeah, I think the biggest deficiency, not only in students I've trained, but new faculty that get hired or I might mentor, is that they just don't understand agriculture. They might have learned, like, you know, the theory, and they focus on research, but when you're trained as a graduate student, you're trained to be a researcher. You don't understand why people do what they do. And I come to understand that more now, and after all of these years. And so some students have said to me, but you grew up in agriculture, you know, I've never actually managed a farm, I've never done those things, so what should I do? And so some of them might just say, well, you're just going to have to roll up your sleeves and get out there. I also think that's part of the issue with academics too. Just in general, they didn't come up through agriculture, and then they see everything very tunnel vision, like, well, why don't they understand what I'm working on? I'm like, and my answer usually is, it's not that they're not listening to you or that you haven't gotten your information out. It's just that they have to worry about moving crews and getting the job done and worrying about whether a porta potty's on site and all these other things that they can't worry about this one little thing. So they need to rely on information coming out and being bombarded with it because they're managing a farm. And there's other things that we don't, as researchers, have to deal with, but they do. And so I think the biggest thing is understanding that, for me, as both a researcher and an outreach specialist, is that we have to design our work to be meaningful to them, and certainly not to put them down in any way, because they know better than we do about what they need to know or what they need to do in their company. But I think that's also the deficiency we see in some of that learning curve, and it's hard to learn that unless you've been in it. So
Sure.
yeah.
Okay, well, that's all the questions that I had for you. Is there anything I should have asked you? Anything else you'd like to talk about here at the end? It's your free forum with an open mic, so.
I don't know how important it is, like, because everybody can find this online, like where I went to school and like undergrad and.
Sure. If you want to go through your CV, that's totally fine. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. Academics are so like that. You ask where they're from, and they always say the school that they came from. Not like this. I don't know. Is it important?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay.
If it is to you, it is. Sure.
Yeah.
That's fine. Yeah.
Well, I guess I want to bring this up because so many students ask me that path, like how I got into viticulture. And a lot of times it's from the degree standpoint. So I grew up in the dairy industry, knew I didn't want to do dairy. But I always thought, I like plants. I like the crops. I like that sort of thing. So when it was time for going into in high school, determining what I was going to do for college, I knew I wanted to do something with plant science. And I thought botany or horticulture. And at that time, you're kind of like, what's the difference, And so I very quickly, in learning about it, botany was more systematics, very basic. And I thought horticulture has to do with actual production. And so I thought, at that stage, I was like, no, I'm going into horticulture because I want to work with something useful, not saying that botany's not useful, but wanted to do something with the producers. So that's what I came from. I came from a farm, so I knew and understood the reason behind the plant science. It wasn't just plant science for the sake of plant science. So I ended up going to an undergraduate degree program at University of Wisconsin River Falls, which has the most, or at that time at least, the biggest undergraduate program in horticulture in Wisconsin. And so went into school just saying I want horticulture. I didn't even know of all the aspects of horticulture, but I learned all of them. But quickly went into my first internship in extension. I did know I wanted to work in extension, just because of the familiarity with extension on more of a county level when I was growing up. And then, so when I was in my bachelor's degree, I took my first internship in kind of public horticulture. Learned I did not want to do public horticulture. I really didn't care if somebody's plant died in their backyard, because to me, that's not really that important. It is important if somebody's crop dies and then that's their livelihood. So I decided, I wanted to not work with public or community horticulture. And so for my second internship later in my bachelor's degree, I did an internship at a research station in the Door Peninsula of Wisconsin. So they could grow different fruit crops there. And that's when I learned about the grapes being grown, and they had a variety trial there for the upper Midwest to see what could grow, and there were new selections from a breeding program in Minnesota. So that was interesting, but I collected data on tree fruits, grapes. I was a sweet pea, like green peas that you eat, scout for a canning company or a freezing company for that summer too. So I got an exposure to different crops, and then I decided I already knew at that point I wanted to go to graduate school, and so I actually applied for graduate programs in vegetable production, tree fruits, and grapes. So I was open-minded, and I eventually decided, no, I want to focus on grapes, and I went to work, and I wanted to focus on grapes in the Midwest. So ended up going to Purdue and working with Bruce Bordelon, who's the small fruit specialist and viticulturist for the state of Indiana. Very small industry, but I got to work on their flagship variety, Traminette, which is a Gewürztraminer hybrid. So it was cold hardy for growth in the Midwest. It was kind of the new variety that had recently been released at that time, and they were growing it. And so I did studies to determine, well, how should we manage this in the vineyard? And can we enhance the aroma profile? And so I did kind of a vine to wine project for my PhD. And then when I was finishing up, I felt so fortunate that multiple job opportunities opened up in different institutions across the U.S. right when I was finishing, because I normally, like if you have a PhD and you want to go into academia, you got to go where the jobs are. So I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to interview in the same year at different institutions, and then came out to Oregon right after I finished. So yeah, and it's been a great ride ever since.
How different was it going from Midwest grape crops to Oregon grape crops?
I thought I died and gone to heaven, only because all I kept thinking, and I still think this now, but my first couple of years I'm like, I don't know what they're complaining about. This fruit is beautiful, there's no insect pests, there's no humidity, there's not rain all summer, because I call it the viticulture boot camp in the Midwest, because you have about, tons more diseases you have to spray for. You have insects you have to spray for, and you have, you're battling the worst conditions, it seems, at harvest. So to be trained in that in the Midwest and then come here, it's like, oh, you have really only botrytis and powdery mildew you have to spray for. We don't really spray for any insects, at least in the Willamette Valley. Life is good. Fruit looks good. Maybe you have to be concerned about rain, but it's cool, so you don't get botrytis development. So I thought, oh, life could be worse.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your answers. Wonderful to hear your story. We'll go ahead
Thank
and let you free now.